Hello, my name is Richard Kapwala. During this video, I'm going to demonstrate how you can utilize a very powerful tool that's available to you in DAZ3d. It's called the Transfer Utility. The figure you see dancing right now is a mesh that I made in Meshmixer and Sculptris. If you've used DAZ3d before, you're probably not very impressed with what you're seeing on the screen. It's just the standard animation blocks that ship with DAZ3d. I've made no attempt to correct the feet or fix anything in the animation or to add anything to the animation. But what is interesting is that is one contiguous mesh. And even more amazing, it took me just 5 minutes to transfer all the rigging from the Genesis figure to my own mesh. That includes the entire hierarchy of bones and the weight maps in just 5 minutes using the transfer utility provided in DAZ3d. I think it's important to point out that I've made no adjustments to the bones or the weight maps after the transfer was complete. Of course, it's obvious that some adjustments need to be made to take care of the distortion in the shoulders, the crotch, and the toes. But you have to admit it's not a bad animation for 5 minutes of rigging. Although the transfer utility is insanely simple to use, your meshes must conform to the proportions of the Genesis figure or your transfer will fail. So during the majority of this video, I'm going to demonstrate how I make my meshes conform to the proportions of the Genesis figure. I like to start out with a simple sculpty rectangle that I make in hexagon. The rectangle is 23.7 units wide by 70.9 units high by 11.79 units deep. After importing the rectangle in Meshmixer, I append a Genesis mesh to the scene. I need to make a few adjustments to the rectangle to make sure it matches the proportions of the Genesis torso exactly. This is easy to do in Meshmixer, but not so easy to do in Sculptris. Sculptris has its own unique set of rules when it comes to adding other objects to the scene. Sculptris will randomly decide the size and location of the new object you add. Meshmixer, on the other hand, loads each object in its original location at its original size, and it has this cool invisibility feature. This is a pretty handy feature when the object you need to work on is inside of another object. Now that I've got the rectangle right where I want it, I'm going to start making the arms. First, I select some polygons to extrude from the rectangle. Once I'm sure I have enough polygons, I smooth the boundaries out. I'm going for a nice round selection so that I have a nice round extrusion. DAZ meshes are about 189 units high. Because of its size, I'm going to have to extrude the same plane a few times just to get to the normal arm length. Once I create an extrusion, roughly the length of the arm up to the knuckles of the hand, I switch to wireframe mode. This makes it easier for me to select the forearms portion of the extrusion. Now I'm going to rotate this section of the extrusion so that it's in line with the forearm of the mesh. Meshmixer has a universal transformer, so you can rotate and translate at the same time. The universal transforming tool also allows you to scale. I'm doing the legs now, and they're pretty much done the same way as the arms, so I'm not going to really cover that much. Before I start extruding the fingers, I'm going to do a little bit of scaling on the arm section, particularly around that hand there, so that I get it more or less the thickness of the hand and the same orientation as the hand, to make it easier to pull the fingers out. Some of you might be wondering why I'm not using symmetry in Meshmixer. There's an easy explanation for that. Symmetry sucks in Meshmixer. For that reason, I'm working specifically on the left-hand side of the mesh. I'm not going to do anything to the right-hand side. I'll take care of that when I import the mesh into Sculptris. I'm going to start making the thumb right now. Then I'll move to the index finger, the middle finger, the ring finger, and the pinky. Making the thumbs pretty much the same as making the arm. I'm just going to use the extrusion tool. And I'm going to start by selecting out some polygons and making sure they're nice and smooth and round. Now I need to rotate the extrusion so that it lines up perfectly with the thumb. Here I'm extruding the tip of the thumb now. It took a while, but now I'm on the pinky finger. The perfect alignment of these digits is critical to a successful transfer. If your mesh is too far out of proportion, you won't inherit some of the bones from the Genesis figure. Your fingers will just be orphaned. To accomplish this alignment, I use the smoothing tool, combination of the smoothing tool and the grip tool, to stretch and pull and smooth the mesh into conformity. Notice that it's not a perfect sculpt at this point. What I'm looking here for right now is position. The toes of the feet are done just like the fingers in the hand. A series of extrusions and then some shaping until they are in line. But in reality, you're probably not going to use the toes much unless you do a lot of nudes. Most of my figures have shoes on, but I'm just putting the toes in place because this is more or less a demonstration of just how important the proportions and locations of the geometry are compared with the quality of the actual mesh. The meshes you saw animated at the beginning of this video took hours and, well, actually days to make through this process. This is merely a demonstration, so I'm not going to spend as much time on this. In fact, what we're going to end up with is a pretty hideous looking mesh, but one that should demonstrate just how powerful the transfer utility is. Okay, this is a pretty ugly mesh, but the fingers of the hands and the toes of the feet and all the joints are in the right location. That's the important thing. Gotten rid of the DAZ mesh just to illustrate the eccentricities of Sculptris when it comes to importing meshes. Before we export this mesh so that we can import it into Sculptris, we're going to need to remesh it. This will get rid of any manifold surfaces or awkward vertex connections that seem to throw an error in Sculptris. Don't forget to select the adaptive option in the remesh tool. Meshmixer defaults to non-adaptive, which is not very good. Now here's where the fun begins. You notice you only have half a person there. Now, in any other 3D application, if you load the object into the scene, it's just going to keep the same position, but not so in Sculptris. Notice how it's off-center? Sculptris centers the entire piece, so that when you turn on symmetry, you end up with stuff like this. Not what you wanted, right? So you have to actually load a mesh in with this to make it work. I apologize for being a little bit critical of Sculptris and Meshmixer. These are very powerful applications, and these are free applications. I used to own a copy of Lightwave 3D. It was very expensive, and it was a complete suite of tools that you needed to do 3D animation. But the annual license for Lightwave 3D is in the thousands of dollars. These tools, like I said, are free or relatively inexpensive. So my hat is off to the developers of Sculptris and Meshmixer and MeshLab and DAZ3d. You guys are great. I hope that these petty criticisms don't offend you. I'm turning on symmetry again, but this time we have the DAZ mesh loaded with our mesh. Now both sides of our mesh should be copied equally. Even though the mesh is hideous and ghoulish looking, all the fingers and toes and knees and elbows are in the right positions, and this is very important. I'm going to go ahead and export the completed mesh, and when I'm done with that, I'll import it into DAZ3d. Hope you're keeping track of time now. We're starting the transfer of the rigging. Switching to the screen that has the transfer utility. Clicking on the transfer utility, I'm going to go ahead and select the Genesis as the source, and the type is default. And our mesh is the target, and type is current. Then the type, content type is going to be actor. I'll hit accept, and DAZ3d will do the rest. I have dual monitors, so you're not going to be able to see the handy little progress menu that pops up when you do a transfer. But you will know the transfer is getting near complete because an orange bar will appear at the lower right hand corner of your screen, and that's the projection map, and you'll see the progress increase to 100%, and when it reaches 100%, the rigging will have been completely transferred. Sorry about the squeaky chair. I didn't want to edit out the sound because I want you to see the complete transition of the rigging. Hope it doesn't kill your ears. You should see the orange bar now down at your lower right hand of your screen. It's a projection map being generated. Okay, now we've got a rigged mesh, completely rigged, weights, bones, everything. Now let's try it out. We'll do a few animations to see how well the rigging transferred over. DAZ can't do animation at 20 frames per second in real time, so it's going to look a little bit jerky, but you'll get the idea. If the transfer was a failure, these moves would completely distort the mesh. you'd get anything from gigantic spikes shooting out of the face of the mesh or the arms of the mesh to the mesh looking like it's twisted into a pretzel. Especially with this little hand roll here where he's pointing. That will just turn a bad mesh into a big giant mess of looks like pulled taffy. That's not happening here. DAZ comes with standard poses. I'm just going to run this mesh through a couple of them to illustrate just how nicely it turned out. This flying kick, again, your figure could be turned into taffy if it's not positioned right. Notice the little boxing stance, how perfectly the hands are held in the fist, and here he is shooting a gun. And again, the hands, the feet, everything is pretty well animated. Even though it's a pretty horrible mesh, I'll admit that. I didn't take as much time as I should have on it, but the important thing, like I said, is the position of all the limbs and the fingers. It just makes all the difference in the world. And that's it for my transfer tool tutorial or demonstration, whatever you want to call it. I hope it was helpful. For those of us who've manually rigged meshes before, I'm sure you're going to agree that what DAZ has done here is pretty fantastic. This has eliminated weeks of work on a mesh. Kudos DAZ, Meshmixer, MeshLab, and Sculptris. You guys have done a wonderful job on these applications, and I just feel very grateful that you've made them free for us to learn and use.